Hello, everyone. This is Najam Sethi, and I have with me tonight Professor Noam Chomsky. Professor Chomsky doesn't need any introduction, but I need to introduce this series of ThinkFest conversations to you again. The first conversation was with William Dalrymple. The second one was with Anatole Lieven. And now I have the privilege of talking to Professor Chomsky. I just want to give you a brief introduction to Professor Chomsky also, although he doesn't need any introductions. But still, for the sake of young people who are not terribly familiar with his life and his devotion and dedication to public service as possibly the world's leading public intellectual of our times. Professor Chomsky is a linguist and a philosopher, but that is how he's known in academic circles. But in progressive, intellectual, and political circles, he's a towering voice on the subject of politics, ideology, power, foreign policy, American hegemony, and so on and so forth. Things that shape the modern world. He has over 100 books to his credit. Can you believe it? Over 100 books. And he has over 24 honorary degrees from across the globe, from Harvard in America, Cambridge University in the UK, Calcutta, far away, and so on and so forth. Of course, he's an alumni of MIT. So without further ado, let me get straight to the question and answer session with Professor Chomsky. Noam, it's good to see you again after a long time.
Yes, I remember our visit very well.
Yes, a lot of people will not know because Noam Chomsky and his wife Carol at that time came to Pakistan in 2002 to give a series of lectures here in Lahore at our invitation, the invitation of the Daily Times, which I was editing at that time. And I can tell you one thing, we'd advertised it and many of us were not sure how well Lahoris were acquainted with Professor Chomsky's works. But in the end, we had a hall that was meant to accommodate 1,000 people. And in the end, we had to accommodate over 2,000 people. And we had to put people at the gates to stop people from gate crashing. That was the sort of interest Noam aroused at that time. And that is in 2002. So you can well imagine, it's been many years since he was in Lahore. And I was just asking him what sort of memories he carries of those days, a few days that he spent in Lahore.
It was a very enlightening visit, especially that lovely evening at your home.
Thank you. Well, I must tell you that Lahoris remember you with great fondness. When people found out that we were going to be talking to you tonight, a lot of them sent in questions. A lot of young people sent in a lot of questions. And I'm afraid that we will not be able to ask all those questions of you because we have only 45 minutes or so. But I will try and summarize many of them and in the hope that we can put them all together in terms of a coherence.
Okay.
So, Professor, the first question that I have on my agenda is a question a lot of people are asking, and I think you have answered it in different interviews, but I think for our Pakistani audiences, it would be great for you to tell us once again. President Bush talked about the arrival of a pandemic, the possibility or the threat of a pandemic. That was like 10 years ago. President Obama talked about it. Bill Gates has been talking about it. And yet, when it does happen, it seems America and the rest of the world are totally unprepared for it. How do you explain that?
Well, there's a very simple reason. President George H.W. Bush, the first Bush, back in 1990, established a scientific review board for the President Scientific Advisory Council, PSAC. Soon as Obama came into office, one of his first acts was to call the committee together, discuss crucial issues with them, and then he requested right away that they prepare a study on how to act in the case of a pandemic coming. It was understood that a pandemic was very likely, After the SARS epidemic in 2003, coronavirus epidemic was contained, but scientists knew that it was very likely that another and more severe one would come. They knew how to prepare for it. They had started working on vaccines. We can talk later about why that didn't proceed, but anyway, they began. So Obama did call on PSAC to provide a program for dealing with an eventual pandemic. And a few weeks later, they came up with a program. Government began to implement it. There were preparations in place. Well, in January 2017, President Trump took office. First things he did within the first few days was dismantle the entire system, throw it out. He also began eliminating the Scientific Advisory Council. This is, he's trying to turn the country into one that you will recognize, Pakistan, a country that has no interest in science. He wants the government to eliminate science. One of his, and in fact, the whole scientific advisory apparatus has pretty much been dismantled. He's following the advice of one of his favorite figures, Rush Limbaugh, to whom he gave the Presidential Medal of Honor, a radio television personality who reaches tens of millions of people. And he's the main source of information for Republicans, along with Fox News. And according to Limbaugh, there are four corners of deceit in the world. One of them is academia, the other is government, the other is media, and the last is science. They exist on the basis of deceit. Can't pay any attention to them. So that's one of the hallmarks of the administration. Trump went on to defund the Center for Disease Control and other health-related components of the government. The US did have programs in which scientists were working in China with Chinese scientists to try to identify potential coronaviruses deep in caves where there are bats and so on. Trump eliminated the programs. In 2017, US intelligence warned the government that there was a potential pandemic coming. They were dismissed. When the pandemic finally came, the United States was uniquely unprepared to deal with it. That's what happens when you throw science out the window, when you change policy to have one goal, enriching the wealthy and strengthening private power, and throw out everything else. That's what happens. Now, of course, you can't blame this entirely on Trump. There are deeper problems. The deeper problem is capitalism. It's a capitalist crisis. We should recognize that. In 2003, as I said, scientists were warning the world another virus is coming, maybe a worse one. Well, it's not enough to have the knowledge. Somebody has to do something about it. Who could it be? Well, the obvious candidate is the drug companies. They have all the resources, the huge profits. The World Trade Organization agreements give them enormous monopoly patent rights. They have profits coming out of their ears, but they can't do it because they follow capitalist logic, which is you do what's profitable. And it's not profitable to prepare for a catastrophe that'll come down the road. Well, there's an alternative, government. Actually, government does most of the research for vaccines and drugs anyway, then hands it over to private companies. Government has plenty of resources, outstanding laboratories, but they can't do it. because of something called neoliberalism. You may recall when President Reagan, Margaret Thatcher came into office 40 years ago, their slogan was, "Government is the problem, not the solution." That means decisions have to be transferred from government, which is partially accountable to the population, into the hands of private tyrannies, corporations, which are totally unaccountable to the population. There is no alternative, as Thatcher put it. So the government is out. So therefore nobody can do it. So there was no preparation on the part of any of the governments that were subjected to the neoliberal plague. And it is a plague. It's been very harmful to people all over the world, very beneficial to the designers. Wealth has concentrated to an extraordinary degree. Corporations are more powerful than ever. Financial institutions, which are mostly predatory and harmful to the economy, have almost taken over the economy. It's been a general disaster. Leads to crisis after crisis. The 2008 crisis caused by financial institutions was pretty serious. They were bailed out. They assume that whatever they do, they don't want government to help people, but it has to be there to help them. That's happening again right now as we speak. The US government has produced an enormous stimulus, several $1 trillion. Most of it is being fed to banks to decide to do with what they want. You can guess what they're doing. The Treasury is pouring huge amounts of money into buying stocks and bonds to keep the stock market high. That benefits rich investors and management. It does almost nothing for the economy. They're not putting the money into the pockets of people, into developing infrastructure, into improving education and health, things that could actually grow the economy. It's a difference. It's a neoliberal society run for the benefit of private wealth and corporate, mostly financial power. So yes, there's disaster after disaster. Another pandemic is sure to come. Scientists are warning about it right now. It'll be worse than this one.
Yeah. But Professor Chomsky, I remember in October of 2019, there was something happening in Washington, D.C., I think it was Event 2001, where a lot of people came and did a simulation exercise about what would happen in the event of a pandemic. And there are a lot of conspiracy theories going around that there was some knowledge about something that was about to happen in certain circles, but a simulation exercise.
The simulation. Yes,
if you remember,
major
201.
2019, there was a major simulation, October 2019.
Yes.
Yes, it was a simulation of a potential. It was they ran through what could happen and what you should do about it. U.S. government totally ignored it. Totally. In fact, Europe ignored it too.
But this was so close to an event that was about to happen, so there are a lot of conspiracy theories about it. Do you buy any of that, or do you think this was just something that was in the pipeline, and they came and they discussed and they never came to any conclusions in terms of how to advise various governments?
Because under neoliberal rules, you pay no attention to what benefits people. You pay no attention to governments. You labor to put power in the hands of private wealth and private enterprises, the corporate system. That is the goal of policy. You can see it all over. Take the United States, which is in the lead. By now, wages have stagnated for 40 years. Real wages of American workers are about what they were 40 years ago. Meanwhile, wealth has concentrated to an extraordinary degree. 0.1%, not 1%, 0.1% of the population has 20% of the wealth. A majority of the population live from paycheck to paycheck, nothing extra in case something happens. It affects the hospital system. So the hospital system, like everything, has to be run on a business model. A business model means no spare capacity. If you're producing an automobile, you have an assembly line, you don't want to have spare capacity. That wastes money. So for profit, you just use the minimum that's required. Well, you can get away with it in producing automobiles. You can't get away with it in the health system. Now, the health system, if anything slightly goes wrong, it's a disaster. No extra beds, no nurses, no diagnostic capacity. Everything collapses. That's on top of the fact that the United States is almost alone in the world in having a privatized healthcare system. There is no government national healthcare. It's a highly inefficient system, about twice the expenses of comparable countries, some of the worst outcomes. The world's leading medical journal, The Lancet in England, recently had a review of it. It concluded that the system wastes about $500 billion a year and about 70,000 extra deaths. That's what happens when you have a business-run, privatized system aiming for profit, not health. Now, actually, the United States does have a universal healthcare system. It's called emergency rooms. If you can drag yourself to an emergency room, the law requires that they take care of you. It's the most expensive, savage, cruel system of universal health care anywhere, but is exactly in accord with neoliberal principles. Wherever they apply, you have one or another form of this kind of savagery.
Professor Chomsky, you say that President Trump is all about me, capital M, capital E. I mean, that's interesting. And what does me stand for? Because in April of this year, there was a Pew Research study that said that nearly 83% of Republicans thought that he was handling the COVID crisis rather well. I mean, this is in April, as late as April. What is it about the Republican Party and President Trump and his ideology that gives him the support?
For background, you have to see what happened when the pandemic struck. By mid-January, Chinese scientists had identified the virus, sequenced the genome, given the information to the World Health Organization, the entire world. The virologists all over the world knew exactly what was happening. Some countries reacted, countries where the government has some concern for their citizens. So the countries of East Asia, Oceania, New Zealand, Australia, they reacted at once. They now have the pandemic pretty much under control. New Zealand has no cases. Taiwan, South Korea, almost none. Europe waited. They didn't pay much attention to these Asians. And finally, they began to act in one or another way. The better organized societies like Germany and Norway have it pretty much under control. The United Kingdom, not very well. The United States did nothing. US intelligence was banging on the doors of the White House, trying to get President Trump to pay attention. He didn't care. He just looks at his TV ratings and the stock market. Finally, in March, 2 months later, he had already been responsible for killing tens of thousands of Americans. And finally, he began to pay some attention. Since then, it's been total chaos. You have to understand that Trump is people call him fascist. I don't think that's the right term. He's like a tin pot dictator of a small country. He just has to have total power in his hands, has to run everything. If anybody crosses him, throw him out. So a couple of weeks ago, for example, the scientist who's at the head of vaccine production made some comments about Trump's quack medicines. He was fired. A few days ago, one senator, the first Republican senator to dare to say something, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, said she was uncomfortable with some of the things Trump was doing. He launched into a huge attack on her, said he's going to destroy her. Nobody can say anything. Okay, this is a small-time dictator, malignant, a psychopath, destroy anything for his own benefit and for the benefit of those he works for, private wealth and corporate power. But yet, exactly as you say, 83% of Republicans say he's doing a good job on the pandemic. If you want to know why, you have to look at where Republicans get their information from. It's been studied. 3 sources. One of them is Fox News, which is an echo chamber of the government. The other is Rush Limbaugh, who I already talked about. The third is Breitbart News, started by Steve Bannon, another echo of the government. Okay, it's like living in a totalitarian state where all you hear is government propaganda. If that's what you hear, what are you supposed to believe? Furthermore,
so I'll come to the question of the media. I'll just come back to the question of the media, but there's another question that comes to mind, because the media is not just about COVID. The media is also about what happened subsequently or what has happened recently. The so-called race riot has become something much bigger than that. For 50 years, you've had race riots, but this was completely unprecedented. Nobody could have anticipated this. Nobody did. And it has now cut across regions, race, ethnicity, class, color, everything. Well, it's just happened all of a sudden. Things have come together and sparked off something that is now leading to all sorts of manifestations of hope in terms of what the future brings. People were depressed about COVID, how it would affect the world. And now after this, there is a lot of hope that perhaps there is possibility of change for good because of the forces of progressivism that have now come together and are challenging American hegemony and Western neoliberal economics and market forces and so on. So now how do you actually, what do you think has led to this? How have all these people come together at this particular moment and exploded?
It's a moment that's certainly true. We were talking about Republicans, not people. The Republicans are a minority party in the United States. They're based, the only reason they win elections is because of the highly regressive American political system, which does allow, because of the way it's set up, we could talk about the details, but there's a major constitutional crisis coming up in the United States because of this. There are very positive developments. Let's take the reaction to the George Floyd murder. There's an enormous reaction all over the country, completely unprecedented. There's been nothing like it. There have been reactions to police murders before, but they were localized in the place where it happened. So in Los Angeles, 30 years ago, you may recall the Rodney King, a black man practically beaten to death by police. There were riots for a week, 60 people killed, called in federal troops, but it was in Los Angeles. There have been others since. There's been nothing like this. All over the country, people are aroused, enormous crowds, solidarity, black and white, even support from the highest military command. The former chiefs of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, top of the military, have expressed support for the protesters. All of this is completely without precedent, and there's widespread concern all over that this neoliberal system has to be overthrown and changed, even in the most extraordinary places. So the leading business journal in the world is the Financial Times of London, business journal, had an editorial saying we have to have radical changes, their word, in the socioeconomic system. This is a disaster. There's plenty of force for it, but it has to be organized. Those who created the system are hard at work to make sure that it remains, even in a harsher form, with more surveillance, more control. They're working on it right now. I can give you details. Trump, for example, right during the pandemic, is using the opportunity to continue to expand a deregulation of fossil fuels and emissions. So make sure that the industries that are destroying the world are even more free to do it. He's trying to make these destruction of the regulatory apparatus permanent, quietly, while nobody's looking. I've mentioned what they're doing with the bailout. All efforts to ensure that the system remains. And if people don't get organized to stop it, that's what will happen. So yes, there's plenty of energy, plenty of enthusiasm, has to be organized.
I mean, is it true? I mean, would it be true to say that you're 91 years old? Do you now see that your long struggle of activism and of other people like yourself, and in recent times, Bernie Sanders, who's, I think he's had a role to play in raising consciousness in the new generation. Professor Chomsky, my question is, do you think Bernie Sanders, his campaign for a more progressive capitalism or progressive America, do you think that has contributed in some way to raising the consciousness of the people who came out on the streets across caste and race and ethnicity and color? Because there's been a lot of support for him in America, and there's a lot of support from him in the rest of the world too. That's the sort of leader America needs. And now you've teamed up with him to set up a new organization called Progressive International, which you intend to launch in September of this year. So how do you see things playing out?
Well, the Sanders campaign was an enormous success. It brought together many activist groups that already existed, created new ones. He broke with 100 years of American political history by coming very close to winning an election with no support from private wealth, no support from the corporate sector, no support from the media, just popular support. That hasn't happened for over 100 years. It's a tremendous effect. And the activism that he helped inspire has actually driven the Democratic Party farther to the left than it's ever been since the Roosevelt years, literally. Sanders, along with Yanis Varoufakis in Europe, who organized the M25, that's a transnational Europe organization working to salvage what is valuable in the European Union and to overcome its very serious flaws. So Varoufakis and Sanders combined to initiate a progressive international. They had their first formal opening about a week ago. Their first meeting will be in Iceland in September. In Iceland, because the Prime Minister of Iceland is one of the directors of the Progressive International Initiative. It's bringing in voices from not only Europe and the United States, but all over the global South. It has the possibility to be a major organizing central force for the vast number of people around the world who recognize that we have to escape from the stranglehold of the neoliberal assault on the population. Now we have to go deeper and dismantle the capitalist roots of the crises that we're facing. Now we should recognize we're talking about the pandemic. That's serious, but let's be realistic. We will overcome the pandemic at serious cost because of people like Trump, very serious cost, but it'll be overcome. We're not going to overcome the melting of the Arctic ice sheets, the melting of the glaciers in the Himalayas, the processes which in another 50 years, according to the best scientific analyses, will render much of the habitable world unlivable, which happens to include South Asia. South Asia is facing an extraordinary crisis. If things continue on their present course, in another maybe 50 years, much of the region will be literally unlivable. The water supplies will be, they're already depleted. They'll be much more severely depleted. India and Pakistan, nuclear-armed countries, will be struggling with each other to try to obtain what little water remains. This is a prescription for cataclysm, not just disaster, total cataclysm within another generation or two. And what's being done about this? Not much. It's barely even being discussed. Incidentally,
if I may interject, you're supposed to have famously said that the left or progressive people don't vote for people, they vote against people. Am I to take that to mean that in the presidential election coming up, you would expect progressive leftist people to vote for Joe Biden because they don't want to vote?
You'd expect them to, but unfortunately there's a very irrational strain in parts of the left. It's not new, it's been around for a long time. Very self-destructive strain. If we don't get everything we want, we're going to quit. Okay? So many of the young supporters of Sanders were hoping that he would win the nomination. Came very close, but didn't win. It was a great success, an enormous success, but not a total success. So now they're forming a movement called the Never Biden movement, saying we're not going to vote for Biden, which, if you know arithmetic, means we're going to vote for Trump. You take a vote away from the opposition, same as giving a vote to the other candidate. But to try to get people to understand this is very hard, and it's not new. I can remember during the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese were pleading with Americans not to get involved in violent protests because they understood that violent protests simply build up support for the more reactionary, repressive, violent forces in the United States. But a lot of young kids wanted to show how angry they were. So they'd break windows and attack stores, and, put bombs in university premises and so on. Exactly the means to strengthen support for the war. It was very difficult to talk them out of it. But we can go back to my childhood, since you mentioned my age. My childhood is the 1930s. I can remember very well when the German Communist Party, under Stalin's orders, refused to cooperate with Social Democrats to stop Hitler. That undermined the labor movement, opened the way for Hitler to take over. Their slogan was, they're all social fascists anyway, so we don't care which of them win. That brought us Hitler and all that. This is not new. It's a disease that comes up over and over. You have to try to control it. You have to pay it. I mean, activists should understand that there's two kinds of activism. There's one kind that makes you feel good. There's another kind that actually does good. And they're different. May make you feel good not to vote for a corporate liberal, but you're in fact voting for the worst malignancy you can imagine. You have to think through that. It's like being against science. If you refuse to think, you're going to lead to disaster. You can, one of my favorite slogans from my childhood is a fascist general, one of Franco's favorite generals, 1936. He said in Spanish, "Abajo la inteligencia, viva la muerte." Down with intelligence, viva death. That was his slogan. Okay, we're seeing pieces of it right in Pakistan as well. Down with intelligence.
Yes, I have two more questions. One is, of course, this question of neoliberalism. And you talk about the three challenges that the globe faces, the world faces. You talk about climate change. You talk about the possibility of nuclear war. And then you talk about the possibility that neoliberal authoritarianism might sweep the world. Now, given the current situation when people are actually hoping that the neoliberals can be turned back, how optimistic are you that we will succeed?
They're trying very hard to come back. The same groups that created the situation we're now in are struggling to ensure that it returns in an even harsher form. They're relentless. They don't stop. I've given a few examples. There are many others. And they will succeed unless there is a strong counterforce. And if you look at the people of the world, there's certainly a basis for a strong counterforce which will overthrow the savagery, move on to a much better world. But it has to be organized and active and dedicated and realistic, has to pay attention to the facts. So take Pakistan and India. Pakistanis and Indians have to face the fact that unless they come together in solidarity, end the crazy arms production, turn to the problem of making South Asia survivable. It's not going to survive in 50 or more years on our present course. They have to dedicate themselves to that, put aside the quarrels about where this line is, where that line is, turn to the best scientific knowledge and understanding, gain a realistic picture of the world and where it's going, and work together to end the crazy dedication to creating more means to destroy one another, put an end to that, and work on trying to ensure that people in South Asia will have water to drink, will have lives, livable lives, will be out of the miserable slums in which they are, will have a chance for a decent life, will deal with the enormous problems of heating the globe, which can be done, but it's not we don't have much time to do it. Put an end to nuclear weapons, which will just destroy us. All of that can be done.
Professor Chomsky, I understand your sentiment. Yeah, I understand your sentiments, but next door to Pakistan, we have a neoliberal authoritarian ruler. And this whole notion of I want to breathe, well, the Palestinians are not able to breathe, the Kashmiris are not able to breathe, and yet we see some signs of hope after what we've seen recently in America and in Europe in terms of globalizing a protest against such policies. Now, are you hopeful? Are you really sincerely hopeful that, rhetoric aside, we may be able to make some headway in achieving some of these objectives in the post-corona world?
There's a slogan that Antonio Gramsci made famous when he was in Mussolini's prisons. The slogan was, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. You should be realistic, but you should recognize that there are opportunities, and those are the ones you have to grasp. It doesn't matter how hopeful you feel. There are opportunities, and you have two choices. You can decide it's all over, I'm going to be pessimistic, it's not worth it. You can help ensure that the worst will happen, or you can grasp the opportunities that exist, dedicate yourself to them. Maybe it'll be a better world. It's not much of a choice.
Chomsky, we've heard about martial law in the United States. I mean, this is unheard of. We've been led to believe that this is the greatest democracy in the world, and now we hear of martial law. I mean, those are terms we hear in our part of the world. And now we hear of martial law in the United States. Is there any chance, do you think, that President Trump, in order to win his election, might resort to sort of creation of some sort of militia or something like that?
Well, it's interesting that there has been concern about that for some time. Now the concern is public in mainstream places, even highly respected analysts. So just a few days ago, one of the most highly respected political analysts, a man with long service in the CIA as a political analyst, working mostly in third world countries. He may have been in Pakistan. Robert Baer talked over CNN main television, and he said that if he were a foreign intelligence officer working in the United States, he would think it's on the verge of martial law and dictatorship. And he says it's an amazing fact. Democracies function not so much on the basis of law, on the basis of trust. So take British democracy, oldest in the world. Britain has a constitution. It's about 10 words long. The government has functioned since the 17th century on the basis of trust and good faith. It's assumed that people in government will be trustworthy, not just mafia criminals, that they'll be cooperative, they'll be supportive of one another, they'll more or less have the welfare of the country at heart. That's eroding in Britain, but it's lasted for 350 years. Same in the United States. There happens to be a constitution, but the constitution doesn't prevent the government, the executive, from saying, I'm declaring martial law, everybody else get out. We're running the country with our militias. It's legal. Nobody ever conceived of it as happening because the government functioned as a democratic society. There were plenty of bad things. Richard Nixon did bad things, but nothing like this. The malignancy in the White House now is utterly without precedent. The president doesn't care about anything except himself and his need to placate his rich supporters. He knows that he can get away with his antics as long as the very rich and the corporate sector tolerate him. If they don't tolerate him anymore, he's out. So therefore, his entire legislative program, everything, we go through it point by point, is designed to enrich the very wealthy and to enhance corporate power. It's the tax scam, the deregulation, the opposition to denial of global warming, all of it. will the people stop him? Will others in the government stop him? The Republican Party has disintegrated. This happened before Trump. He made it worse. They're no longer a parliamentary party. If you look at international comparisons, they rank alongside the parties in Europe with neo-fascist origins. And they are totally intimidated by the president. Some of the things that happen, you may not have even observed them, are hard to believe. Like in the executive branch of the government, there are inspector generals for every department, people whose responsibility is to ensure that the department runs honestly, without corruption, without violation of law. Trump has created a huge swamp of corruption, unprecedented in the government. What did he just do? He purged all the inspector generals, threw them all out. And like any petty dictator, he went out of his way to insult the senior Republican senator who had set them up, Charles Grassley, 89-year-old senator, highly respected in the Republican Party. Trump purposely insulted him, said, "Get lost. I'm throwing out your life's work," all the inspector generals. Not one Republican raised a peep about it. They are totally cowardly group of gangsters who are in his pocket, afraid to do anything. The executive branch, he has eliminated everyone in the executive branch who might raise a voice. There is no one there but sycophants. It's not fascism. It's a petty dictator in a small third world ex-colony. That's what he's turning the United States into.
But Professor Chomsky, what is happening to American democracy then? He's turning it into a tin-pot dictatorship. Can American democracy withstand Donald Trump? Is it going to mean that if Trump wins this election, are we then to assume that that is the end of American democracy as we know it?
We'll see. There's a sharp conflict. I'm sure you've seen that the top military command, they're conservatives. They're right-wing. A lot of them from the Deep South. The top military command, the two former chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the four-star general who was Trump's defense secretary, who he kicked out, General Allen, who was in charge of forces in Central and South Asia, Afghanistan, running all the forces, top general, just came out. All of them came out attacking the president, denouncing him, some of them supporting the protesters. The Pentagon, Trump had sent federal troops to Washington. The Pentagon overruled him, withdrew the troops without even consulting him. There's a real crisis brewing. We don't know where it'll go. There's been nothing like this in the history of the United States or England, the two oldest democracies.
Just moving away slightly from America to the global stage, President Trump has alienated even his European allies by his unilateralism in trade and in politics. And for example, in the G7 meeting that is supposed to be held in the near future, the German chancellor has refused to attend. And he's gone and started to invite Russia to it as a guest, although Russia is not a member of the G7. So now, I mean, given this situation, China and Russia are getting together to combat American hegemony. Interesting play over there. The Europeans are keen to work with the Chinese. Isn't Trump going to end up isolating America? And in that sense, is that going to signal the decline of American hegemony?
There's a lot of talk about that, and there has been for 20 or 30 years. It's a mistake. American hegemony is overwhelming. You see it in, it's true that Trump is isolating the United States. That means that people in Europe dislike, hate, fear the United States. But the crucial word is fear. Europe is afraid to step on Trump's toes. If he issues an edict, Europe follows it. We see this all over. Take Iran. Now, there was negotiations which led to a very successful agreement to eliminate any possible threat, if there is a threat. I don't think there is one, but if you think there's a threat of nuclear weapons from Iran, it was eliminated by the treaty. Trump is a wrecker. He's someone who has no idea of how to build anything. He wants to be important, so therefore you wreck things. If you have no ideas about what to do and you want change, you wreck, okay? So he therefore dismantled the entire Iran treaty and imposed very harsh sanctions on Iran. When the United States imposes sanctions, everyone has to obey. They are third-party sanctions. Notice, and Europe doesn't like them. It opposes the Iran sanctions. It opposes the breaking down of the deal. Did it do anything? No. It observes the sanctions. If it doesn't observe the sanctions, it gets thrown out of the international financial system, which is controlled from New York. Of course, Europe could go in an independent direction, but they're afraid to do it. They don't want to stand up against the Godfather. That's happening all over the world. Take Israel-Palestine. Trump came out with what he calls the deal of the century in Palestine. If any other country had done that, say China or Germany, that people would have left. They wouldn't have even paid attention. When Trump comes out with it, it's the law. That's what we work with. We have what we can do with it. This is enormous power. The United States military power totally overwhelms everything in the world, and it's far more sophisticated. And Trump is expanding it enormously, risking war because he doesn't care about war. If there's a nuclear war that destroys everything, it's of no concern to him. He is a sociopath concerned with his short-term gain. But that means the United States is a very frightening country. And just in terms of control of wealth, analysts point out that the US share of gross domestic product, GDP, is declining. But what they don't look at is something more important. What share of global wealth is in the hands of US-based corporations? Turns out 50%. There's a very good political economist in Hong Kong, Sean Kenji Stars, who's done the main work on this. Half the wealth of the world is in the hands of US-based multinationals, way ahead of China, way ahead of Europe. Almost every sector, US corporations are in the lead. So as long as the wealth is there, the military power is there, a maniac like Trump can do pretty much what he wants, as long as the American people allow him. So the question, as I remember, we're talking about democracies that have been around for 350 years in the case of Britain, 250 years in the case of the United States. They are facing a crisis that has never arisen in these hundreds of years. There's something like it in Britain too, with Boris Johnson, not quite as bad. These are globally, these are enormously serious matters. Now let's talk a little bit about alienating Europe. In the chaos of the Trump White House, you can perceive a geostrategic plan. It's there and it's being implemented. The idea is to construct a reactionary international of the harshest, most brutal states in the world, controlled by the White House. In the Middle East, that means the Gulf dictatorships, the family dictatorships of the Gulf, Egypt under the al-Sisi dictatorship, the harshest in Egypt's history, Israel moving very far to the right, now a central part of this reactionary system. Go over to India. Modi's India is a perfect candidate. Don't have to describe what's happening, so he'll be part of it. Move on to Europe, Hungary under Orban, who's turning it into a private dictatorship. People like Mario Salvini in Italy, very powerful, loves to see people, Africans, dying in the Mediterranean, fleeing from countries that have been devastated by Europe for centuries. There's a collection of such people and such governments. He's forging them together into a reactionary international. The progressive international that you brought up properly is a counter to this. And the question is which will prevail on the global scene. So a lot of things are happening that are very important. The most important we should never forget is the roasting of the earth. That is going to destroy us, especially South Asia, which is the prime target, the main target. South Asia is going to disappear unless this is terminated and quickly. The second most important thing is nuclear war. Trump has torn apart, destroyed the entire arms control regime, which provided some degree of protection. He's virtually pleading with Russia to develop new weapons of mass destruction that can destroy everything. He's doing it himself and doing it very ostentatiously so that others will imitate it. If these things continue, nothing else matters, nothing. And there's time to stop them, not a lot.
See, coming to the close of this interview, two questions. The first is, of course, you pose the problem in this manner, that it's autocratic regimes and neoliberal markets versus voices for national reconstruction of society. That's how you pose the future choices that we have. But you also then say, somewhere I think I've read, that you say that the general population doesn't know what's happening, and it doesn't know that it doesn't know.
A large part of the population.
Yes.
The
So
Republican Party. And if there were time, there are interesting demographic facts behind this. I really don't have time to go into them, but if you look at the United States, up until the Second World War, the United States was the richest country in the world by far, but it was intellectually kind of a backwater. There were exceptions, but if you wanted to study physics, you went to Germany. You wanted to be a writer, you went to Paris. The cultural centers of the world were Europe. The United States was kind of a backwater. There were exceptions, but that's pretty much what it was. Well, the war changed all of that. Everything moved to the United States, but only in part. Part of the United States became part of the world of the Enlightenment. Part of it stayed where it was. A rural, Christian, evangelical, traditional America stayed where it was. Okay, that's the base of the Republican Party, along with the affluent. The affluent are always part of the Republican Party. It works for them. But there's a voting base. Remember that 25% of the American population is evangelical Christian, people who think that Christ is coming very soon in their lifetime. Trump, he's a very good politician. He keeps throwing them gifts so that they'll support him totally. You take a look at the pandemic. It's the first the pandemic hit most harshly in heavily settled areas, urban areas. You go to the rural areas where people are more scattered. It didn't hit quite that hard at first. It's now spreading now, but not before. So you take a farmer in Wyoming, he looks around, he doesn't see any sick people. He says it's something in that urban area where they have all these blacks and Hispanics, these diseased people, so I'll support Trump. And Trump is playing with that. He's a skilled politician. He's a skilled demagogue, sociopath, but a demagogue. And he's trying to create a kind of race and culture war in which he'll be able to maintain a reactionary voting base while serving the rich and powerful and destroying everything in his path. Will it succeed? We don't know. I talked about, as I said, even the highest military officials are deeply concerned about this. Will much of the rest of the population is? Can they get together to stop it? We don't know. Remember, this is without precedent in 350 years of Western democracy. 350 years in Britain, 250 years in the United States. Never happened before. So will it? And of course, it's happening at a time of huge crisis for the entire human species. Global warming is going to attack everybody. Nuclear war will destroy everybody. We're living in an extraordinary moment of human history. Crises of a kind that have never arisen in entire human history. Threats to democracy which haven't risen in hundreds of years, all coming together at the same time that we have an unprecedented pandemic raging. Very difficult moments. We have to be clear-headed, rational, think carefully, ask what can be done to deal with them. There's no time to waste. And I'm very sorry, but I have another interview coming.
I have one last comment required from you. We know that the US is in trouble, in deep trouble. And you said so is the rest of the world because the US is in deep trouble. But then asked to explain where do we go from here? And you're quoted to have said, and I'd like you to just explain what you mean. You're quoted to have said, it depends on the peasants with the pitchforks.
That's right.
What did you mean by that?
That's an image that's constantly used to mean that the people are rising up and won't accept oppression any further. That's the peasants with the pitchforks. The corporate sector is afraid of it. If you look at the last conference in Davos, where every January the rich and powerful get together at a fancy ski resort in Switzerland and they congratulate each other on how wonderful they are and go skiing and have parties and so on. This year was different. You go back to the Davos conference, they were there, but they were worried. They were concerned that the peasants are coming with their pitchforks. One of the main theme of the conference was statements when we said, yes, we've made a lot of mistakes. We've harmed you. We've done the wrong things. But now we understand. We're going to be much better. We're not going to make those mistakes. We're going to work for you. You can put your trust in us. So go back home and be quiet because we've got things under control. They're afraid of what is called reputational risks. That means the peasants with their pitchforks. And if the peasants with their pitchforks keep coming, you can change the world.
Excellent. That's a very hopeful note, Professor. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed this enormously. I hope all the other people who've tuned in have also enjoyed it. It's been a long time, and I would have invited you to come to Pakistan again if your health permits. It would be an honor to host you again, Professor. And once again, thank you very much for taking this time out.
Thank you. Enjoyed it very much.
Thank you. So I hope, and I've tried to ask all the questions that I thought were relevant. Obviously, in 45 minutes or an hour, you can't really ask every question. There were some questions that were still pending, but he had to go. And we don't really want to edit this interview in any way. So there it is. And until the next ThinkFest session, goodbye.